At Lookup TV across your social media platforms, I am Matkia Gesimba. Thank you very much for sticking around. Should have said welcome back. All right, let me introduce the subject that we are getting into at this particular moment. Now, at the onset of 2022, Kenya's new data protection regulations came into effect, essentially giving proper guidelines about what businesses and individuals outside and inside the country can do to information gathered about Kenyan citizens. The new Data Protection Act is way far-reaching and will change the way that businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, relate with the data that they collect on their day-to-day operations within and outside the Kenyan economy. Today, we ask the question, do you, as an individual, know what the law states about data privacy? Again, do you, as an individual running a business that is reliant on data for success, especially in the new digital dispensation, know what you need to do with the data that you have, collect and process so that you can make your business run? If your answer is no, then this is your show. All right, joining us on Lookup Business on this particular one, we do have Chip Koech Rotich, who's an advocate of the High Court. How are you doing?
Hello, Simba.
Fantastic. Happy to have you around.
Happy to be here.
So for any other person who wants to know, what is the journey that Kenya has taken to achieving the Data Protection Act? What is the history behind this act?
Okay, so I can talk about the journey of the Data Protection Act in maybe two ways. I can talk about the industry background and then I can give a legal background. I think 2007, or I'll say 2007, kind of marked or is a marker into Kenya's, kind of advancement into like the digital age. The most recent decade has seen technological advancements like never before, and also in terms of internet penetration, in terms of device and mobile device access and connectivity.
Yes.
It has been at a rate that has never been seen before. More Kenyans now more than ever are connected to the internet and have access to mobile devices and technology. And in a correlate sense, the government has also in that same decade really embraced technological advancements. We have seen, this kind of like digital migration of government services from analog to digital. We've seen the government sign on to, the Belt and Roads Initiative of China, which is basically, an export project to bring, state control, or let me say technology like surveillance and artificial intelligence that's capable of giving governments control over the internet space and the digital space. So we're seeing all of these developments happening at an accelerated pace and also simultaneously, right? So of course, what happens is that there's going to be a concern with regards to the right to privacy. While all of this is happening, the question comes up, with all this data being collected online, with all of this happening, is the right to privacy safe? Is this data being handled with care, right? So that leads me to like the legal background. In 2010, of course, we promulgated our beautiful constitution.
No longer new.
No longer new.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the hallmarks of the Bill of Rights is Article 31, which is the right to privacy. And the Data Protection Act actually directly emanates from that. It's the purpose of the Data Protection Act is to realize, Article 31. So in 2011, the Communications Authority of Kenya, set up a task force to create a legal framework for data protection in the country. So they engaged stakeholders, as they usually do. And by 2015, the stakeholder engagement and public participation was now incorporated into what we now saw as the first draft data protection bill. right? And then that was tabled to Parliament, and in 2019, it was assented to, and it became the Data Protection Act, which is now the law that governs data protection in Kenya.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's just a brief journey
of exactly
if I could
where we've been
summarize.
all the way
Exactly.
up to realizing
Yeah.
this particular act.
Yeah.
Now, before we delve deep into our conversation today, which is essentially going to be about whether people and businesses do realize what this then means, I know you're actively involved in an initiative called Linda Data Initiative. Quickly then, could you talk to us about what that is and why you're involved in it?
Okay, so the Linda Data Initiative is a community-led, youth-led initiative that is purposed to bridge the knowledge gap in data protection matters and data privacy rights and digital rights broadly.
Yes.
For the Kenyan youth. It's supported by Amnesty International, and the work is just around, bringing attention to those digital rights issues that affect, of course, the Kenyan youth. And I think the importance of choosing the Kenyan youth as like a focal point is because young people in Kenya, I think, are in a really unique position. They are, number one, the largest users and consumers of the internet space, right? In terms of the people who are on social media, the people who are on their phones a lot, it's the Kenyan youth. But at the same time, there are also a really huge majority of the people that participate in the digital economy, right? These young people are using it for entertainment, but they're also using it to build livelihoods. We have all sorts of businesses cropping up online. We have influencers now, so there's a lot of youth-led kind of movement within the digital space. So that's why Linda Data actually focuses on young people and the youth in Kenya. And we noticed that, of course, being such a big stakeholder in the digital space, there's a need, to be informed on your digital rights. So the Linda Data Initiative actually carried out a survey amongst thousands of Kenyan youth, and the survey findings were to look at what issues do the youth think are the most pressing when it comes to their digital rights. What are they most concerned about?
Yes. And
what we found from this findings was there were three main issues that were of primary concern for young people, and that was disinformation and misinformation online, especially in the context of an electoral cycle. And then there was issues of informed consent of social media terms and conditions specifically. And then there was data misuse in terms of just private and public companies who, hold so much data. And out of the three, the most popular, the one that the youth were most concerned with, was data misuse. So we are now working in research, and our work basically centers research and advocacy to bridge the knowledge gap in that area.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Good. Let's now delve into the conversation now. And it's a good thing that you're saying that even the Linda Data Initiative is really looking at what this digital space then would mean in terms of data protection and data privacy.
Yeah.
For youth-led businesses, which we do know are 21st century businesses, they got to leverage very heavily on the digital economy. The digital economy runs on data collection and using of this data then to actually make business decisions. What does the law now then say about digital data in relation to use and collection?
For businesses?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the main principles when it comes to businesses using data, collecting data, processing data, is obviously, number one, compliance with the Data Protection Act.
Yes.
And that, of course, implies the respect of the rights of data subjects under the Data Protection Act. So, issues of consent, obtaining consent, issues of making sure that the right to privacy is not violated, and all of that. But then there's also obligations on the business itself, which is things like registration as a controller or a processor. And of course, there's an obligation for notification if there's been a data breach. But I think in an overarching way, the point for businesses is that they should embed the principles of the Data Protection Act
Yes.
when they are using, collecting, and processing the data within their possession.
Yes.
Right? So that means, and when I talk about the principles, under the Act, they're actually the principle set out. It has set out principles under Section 25, and they lean on lawfulness and fairness and transparency, and this is just basically concepts of, you know, processing data in a lawful way, ensuring that you, like I just mentioned, ensuring that you obtain consent, and not using or not processing data for you know, objectives other than those that were authorized. You know, that's to do with fairness, you know, that's to do with transparency, and of course informing, you know, data subjects on how their data is being used, and just being transparent. So I think any business that is handling data, which I think is every business,
Isn't it? Yeah.
if you can embed those three main principles into your practices, then I think you should be in compliance with the data.
In compliance with the Data
Yeah.
Protection Act.
Yeah.
But then there's another question to you, by the way. You floated that particular post that you're going to come in the studio, and I've got this direct question to you.
Yeah.
That if you find at all, that's what it states, that you find at all that you are at a position of collecting data for the purpose of processing that data, for whatever reason that it is that you want to process that data for, then please inform the data commissioner. Could you take us through that process? Who's the data commissioner in that particular act, and how do you inform them?
Okay, so the Data Protection Act sets up the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner,
Yes.
which is the state office that is in charge of regulating and implementing the Data Protection Act and regulating data protection in Kenya. Yeah. Of course, our Data Protection Commissioner is Ms. Immaculate Kasait. Yeah. In terms of how businesses relate with that office, just to reiterate what I just said, is I think three principles of compliance with the Act itself. That means respecting the rights of data subjects, and registration as a data controller or a processor. So the Act places an obligation. If you are a data controller or you're a data processor, you have to register, right? And the process of registration there is under the registration regulations for data protection, and the ODPC has even released guidelines, which I think is actually a really, really useful document.
Yes.
If anybody can access the guidelines on registration specifically for data controllers and processors, it gives a really simple way of even identifying, are you a controller, are you a processor? And then it gives a breakdown of the registration process. So just to give an idea, like if you want to know if you're a data controller, you can ask yourself a few questions. Do you decide what kind of data is being collected? Do you decide who you're collecting the data from? Do you decide the purpose of collecting that data? What are we going to use it from? If you are the decider of those things, then you are a data controller. A very easy example is an employer.
Yes.
Right? Who holds the data of his employees. If you're a data processor, you're a third party that actually is in a contract with a data controller to process that data for them. So to analyze it, to collect it, you know, those kinds of things. But you don't have the decision-making power as to what data is being collected, who it's being collected from, and what the purpose and what you exactly are using it from.
Yes.
Right? All of your instructions come from that contract, so that makes you the processor.
Yes.
But of course, those are the both of them have the obligation to register. So registration, I think it's a pretty simple process. It comes with a registration. There's a range of registration. The registration fee from 4,000 Kenya shillings for the smallest. I think the businesses with the smallest impact on data privacy, and then 40,000 for like the big players.
Yes.
For the 4,000 mark, I think a good way to know is if your business has an annual turnover of less than 5 million and you have less than 10 employees, then you probably fall under the 4,000 mark, right? And then also under the guidelines, they did give some kind of like considerations that any business can take into account when trying to see where they fall in terms of registration. So that's looking at your annual turnover, looking at the number of employees, asking, are you in the public sector, are you in the private sector,
yes.
Are you an NGO, are you a religious institution, all of those things. But I think the point here is the bigger, you look at your operations, and if there is a huge risk of data protection violations, that means you control a lot of data, you're a big company with a huge market shareholding or something like that, then of course the responsibility is much bigger, on you.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Pretty much. Another question that now comes into this conversation is how, if you're going to be a smaller business and you're not in the business of collecting this data, or it might be an expensive venture for you, you tend to rely majorly on open data.
Okay.
A question that came up is, what does the law envisage about open data? Open from what perspective? Is it open in getting access to it, or open in whatever it is that you want to do with this data?
So it's open in terms of getting access. So I'll say the Data Protection Act doesn't explicitly mention open data, but then conceptually it's something that does exist. We even have, the Kenya Institute of Open Data, but I think it's primarily supposed to manage public data that was, I think, incorporated in Mwai Kibaki's time.
Yes.
But conceptually, open data is just information that is accessible and should be accessible to everybody. It can be public information, but it can also be public information in terms of like information in the public sector, but it can also be private information in terms of information in the private sector. So, like data on, markets, for example, like if you're a business and you want to understand a certain market, that kind of public information can fall under open data. So I think the thing to watch out for when it comes to open data is just transferring open data outside of Kenya, because open data within Kenya is accessible to everybody, right?
Yes.
But then when it comes to transferring such data outside of the Republic, then you have to follow the provisions of the Data Protection Act and the general regulations of data protection.
Yes.
So I think Regulation 40 really expounds on transfer or cross-border transfer of data. And the major principles there are, number one, of course, consent. You have to obtain consent of data subjects. Number two, you have to be transferring this data for necessity. Number three, the process of transferring data outside of the country has to be documented well. And I think number four, and this one is quite important, is that the onus is on the entity transferring the data to ensure that the entity outside the country that receives that data has the necessary infrastructure and framework to safeguard that data and not violate, remember, the right to privacy and the data subject's rights,
yes.
right? Because of course, where does data come from? It belongs to the subject, right? So the onus is on the local entity to do their due diligence and ensure that they know that data is going to be well kept. And then, of course, I think just simple things like giving disclaimers. I think we've all seen those kind of emails. Sometimes you see at the bottom of the email, it says, this is confidential information, do not share this. Just that kind of practice will keep you kind of safe.
Pretty much. Still on the same subject.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to running of businesses, and especially small businesses, which essentially now, it's they're interconnected. You can't say that I'm running a business that just operates locally. If you're going to make proper business decisions, then the data that you have, then you're going to have to rely on it, even transport it outside for you to be able to make sales, make proper business decisions, even do proper marketing.
Yeah.
On that particular one, should an entity then decide to say, this data that I have here as a smaller business is going to enable me make a business decision outside of this particular market? Does that change it? Because they're saying, if it's about Kenyan data, then think about it before making that data cross the border, at the Kenyan border. Where is the thin line between the application of this data here locally, knowing exactly how the digital economy operates, in the sense of it's very easy to rely on data that you have here locally to help you make a business decision outside Kenya, and easily at that?
Okay. I think your question is a little bit
Is it?
convoluted, but let me try my best.
Yes.
I think one thing that we have to remember is the Data Protection Act borrows really heavily on the GDPR, which is the UK and EU legislation on data protection.
Yes.
So I think the principles are kind of similar. You're not going to expect that if you're handling data outside the country, that it's going to be that those core principles of respecting the data subject's rights and such principles don't apply to
Yes.
to those practices. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
pretty much. Let's go into the possible penalties then that somebody who breaks this particular act is liable to. Let's begin. On crossing the borders with data, what are the possible penalties that I'm looking at?
Okay, so the penalties under the Data Protection Act are, let me put them broadly, when it comes to non-compliance, right? So failure to comply with the Data Protection Act attracts, a maximum fine of 5 million or imprisonment of 2 years or both. Failure to comply with what's called an enforcement notice. This is where, once the ODPC realizes that there is an entity that is not complying with the Data Protection Act, they have the right to issue an enforcement notice. If that enforcement notice is ignored, right, or if that enforcement notice is just disobeyed, there's an additional penalty to the non-compliance of the act, right? There's an additional penalty, and that could be, again, a fine of not exceeding 5 million or imprisonment of 2 years or both.
Yes.
And then I think aside from non-compliance, when it comes to registration, because remember that's also an obligation on entities, failure to register as a controller or failure to register as a processor, again, attracts a fine of not exceeding 3 million and an imprisonment of, a hefty imprisonment sentence of not exceeding 10 years or both, right? And then, of course, there is, there can be, let me say, civil penalties in terms of if you breach a data subject's right to privacy, they are entitled to seek civil remedies from the court. So those can be damages that will be determined in a court of law. And I think outside of this scope, there are also sector-specific penalties when it comes to data use. Like, for example, in the health sector, I know that if you contravene the HIV/AIDS Act and you breach confidentiality in that act, there is a fine not exceeding 100,000 and an imprisonment of 2 years. When it comes to the finance sector, I know that the National Payment Systems Act also, if you breach data in that sphere, then there's also a fine. I think it's not exceeding 500,000, and I'm sure there's an imprisonment penalty. So there are those penalties, and they think they just range between a fine, an imprisonment term, or both.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Now, just quick ones. I've got direct questions to you directly
Yeah.
on exactly how people should relate with data. Let me jump into them before I take your final view of exactly where we are with this particular act, because it's fairly new in the country, you will say. Now, I got this direct question to you. You wake up in the morning, You get a direct message to your phone advertising an item from number one, a number you've never registered to, somebody that you've never interacted with. Is that somebody who's breaking your data privacy?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Because you see, I think Kenya, we're actually seeing this at an unprecedented scale.
Yes.
We witnessed this, I think the most significant is the elections, but this is not something new, right? We all go to restaurants, you go, you pay for some food, and then the next thing you know, you're being told,
there's an offer.
2 pizzas, buy one, get one free. So you see, this goes back into when I was telling you about embedding, businesses need to embed the core principles of the Data Protection Act, right? Not using data for purposes other than what it was authorized. If I gave you my phone number to make a payment, I didn't authorize you to now profile me and target target me with ads, you know? So I think that's definitely a huge loophole. I think that's something that can be, I think that's something that probably the Data Protection Commissioner's office has to now, I think, be a bit more forceful or like a bit more, to just like hit that on the head.
Yes.
Because we've seen just how huge the implications of technological misuse can be on the country, especially when it comes to elections, right? This is something we saw. I think everybody was getting messages from political parties. You know, we remember that scandal of political parties registering people fraudulently and without their consent, you know, and that's also something not new. So I think that we have the law, and now I think we just need to really work on tightening the enforcement.
Yes.
You know, because it's a slippery slope.
It is.
It really
100%.
is.
Yes.
And I think, you know, the thing is sometimes people don't see the, you know, when it comes to things like micro-targeting and targeted ads, people don't see the harm, right? People say, it's convenient. People think, okay, fine, they've misused my data, but I mean, I did want that, you know, and that's how targeted ads work. You know, people don't realize that these companies collect your information from from when you go on a website and you click on anything to your preferences on social media. They collect all of that information and they use it to decide, should I show Simba this ad? Should I send Simba 2 large pizzas or 1 medium? You know, and I think, you know what's even interesting is that I almost, with myself, and I think I heard this from a few other people, I noticed a correlation with when you receive M-Pesa and those ads. When you receive M-Pesa, your balance was 0, you get 2,000. I'm not going to say the name, but the pizza company, you know, is there. Yeah. And after the pizza company is the restaurant you went to, and that's not a coincidence, you know. So that definitely shows you that data is being cross-referenced, you know, and it's definitely being used for purposes outside of what we really agreed for.
Yes.
And I think it's something that definitely needs to be looked at with some seriousness.
Pretty much. We only have 45 seconds left. I just want to squeeze this into this as we step out. Number one, somebody says, I don't see the need of me visiting a building and then I have to leave the entire of my data at a building. And number two then, as we clear, it's a fairly new act. You can see exactly how the majority of businesses and people do not understand it in the country, but the fines are hefty. Should you find yourself at fault, what do you think needs to be done in the short term to bring such a new act to the fore so that individuals and businesses then do not find themselves on the wrong side of the law? Just those two in 45 seconds, we clear. I don't know you're going to manage in 45.
Okay. I think obviously the onus is on the ODPC, you know, to really, because one of their mandates is to promote public awareness of data protection, right? And so the onus is really on them to educate the public. Are they really reaching the people who need to be reached, right? And then when it comes to businesses, I think my best advice to businesses would be assess your operations, assess your processes. If you know you are controlling and processing a lot of data, get a data protection officer, you know,
Yes.
on your team.
Yes.
Have a department if need be. Invest in some technologies for data security, you know, but I think that's a thing that you have to access according to the scale of your business. Of course, you're not going to have the same data protection requirements for a huge mobile network operator and a small Instagram shop, you know, so I think that's just how I would say. But I will say that there is a lot of movement. There's a lot of movement in litigation. There's a lot of movement in advocacy. There's a lot of movement in awareness. And there's a huge interest even amongst the Kenyan people to want to know more about data protection. So I think the sky's the limit when it comes to this. And I think, honestly, Kenya is a country that I really believe is really advancing in that space. So I'm very excited for the future, and especially when it comes to litigation, I'm really excited to see the development of digital rights litigation in Africa.
Yes.
And what that's going to look like. So.
Guess what? I'll be calling you back so we have a longer conversation on this.
I can't believe it's been an hour.
We need 2 hours in this, isn't it? That's how you know that we were really deep into this subject.
Yeah.
Guess what? Thank you very much for coming. I'll be calling you back again. I promise. You're going to come back again so we get there's so many, especially on the Linda Data Initiative.
Yes,
so
please
much to
have
talk
me
about,
back.
isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
now,
you also.
Take her back to the times that she joined us today right here on Look at Business, just to talk about the Data Protection Act, a fairly new act in the country, by the way, but which, according to her, you might find yourself paying hefty fines. 5 million, upwards of 50 million. There are other areas where you might go in for 10 years. Think about it. Right here on Look Up TV. My name is Simba Elijah Charles Kiage. Guess what? I'll see you next week for another edition of this. Good night.